A few days ago, I made a video about capitalist defense, I think I titled it. And actually, like the next day, I was reading a book and it actually talked about some pretty pertinent things. Now, the book is not an anarcho-capitalist book. It's not a libertarian book at all. It is, whoops, upside down, The Struggle for Mastery by David Carpenter. This is about the conquest of England by the Normans, the Angevin dynasties. And the guy who wrote it is not a libertarian. It's not meant to be libertarian at all. It's just supposed to be a history of the Norman conquest of England. It covers the time period from 1066 to 1284. And there was a section in there about Wales, about the conquest, or really the lack of conquest, at least initially, of Wales. Just for a little bit of an overview here of the history, the British Isles at that point was basically dominated by one state, the Anglo-Saxon state, that had slowly developed. There had originally been a heptarchy, a system of 7 kingdoms that kind of grew up in the post-Roman era Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And eventually most of them became dominated by the kingdom of Wessex. And most kings of England, so to speak, were descended from the Wessex lines. Now, there had been a long series of invasions by the Danes, or what they called the Danes, what we call Scandinavians. They could either be from Norway or Denmark, typically, but they called them Danes. And actually, early in the 11th century, I think in 1015, 1016, England was actually conquered by the king of Denmark, a guy named Knut, K-N-U-T. And but he married a Wessex heiress, and eventually he was overthrown. Oh, well, actually, he finished out his. He died eventually, and it kind of reverted back to an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And this Anglo-Saxon kingdom was a state. It had a very efficient tax system for the time. It had a mobilized army. It didn't have the classical feudalism that we associate with later history that would develop later, but it basically attempted and created the same type of institutions where people owed taxes to the state and people owed military service to the state. And the kings of England were able to mobilize via coercion, via the typical state ideological functions, a very large and very powerful army. And this army was used to beat off, in 1066, actually, one invasion before the Normans invaded. The Danes, again, under the king Hardrada, invaded, and Harold, the king of England, defeated him. And then England was invaded by William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. Now, William the Conqueror thought that he had the right to, well, I don't know if he really thought he had the right. The king before Harold had been Edward the Confessor, and he'd been a very pious king, and he'd lived for a long time, but he was not the most powerful person in England in a lot of ways. Harold was. And at one point in his career, Edward the Confessor had needed the patronage of the Duke of Normandy, who are themselves actually descended from Latinized Vikings. And basically he promised Duke William that Duke William would be in the succession for the throne of England. Apparently this is true, that he made that promise, but he promised several people over his life. Anyway, when he died, Harold, who was really the most powerful person in the country anyway, became the new king. William decided that he ought to be king instead, and he basically invaded. And the military might of William the Conqueror clashed with the military might of the state of England, and based on one battle, the very famous Battle of Hastings in 1066, the state of England completely changed over hands to William the Conqueror. I mean, there were one or two relatively minor rebellions after that, but in no serious way was the occupation of England by the Normans really challenged. And they systematically went through, and they didn't kill that many people, but they got rid of the old aristocracy, the old Anglo-Saxon barons, most of them, not all literally, but close to it, and replaced them with Norman ones. And they introduced their own ideas about law and basically began a conversion process into more classically understood feudalism that people are a little bit more familiar with in the more archaic forms that were there before. And so even though England's a pretty big country with pretty varied terrain and quite a few people in many cities, just one little victory enabled a pretty small army that have no way of invading the entire country to simply take control of the entire state. And from then on, I mean, the Normans were never dislodged from England ever. Now, this is in marked contrast to what happened in Wales. Now, Wales is far smaller and far poorer than England, but Wales did not have any kind of political unity. It didn't really have anything that could be called a state. It had lots of maybe what you might consider proto-states. They were chieftaincies, but they didn't have authority over everybody. And at one point in the book, he says explicitly that in Wales there could be no Hastings. There was no way to win a battle and then get Wales. It had to be conquered physically, place by place, village by village, valley by valley, river by river. There could be no pretension of legitimacy as there was in England, because William was able to say, Edward the Confessor said, I should be the king. You all pay homage to a king. You believe in the idea of an overlord over everybody, and so I'm simply going to be that overlord. And there were a few minor revolts, but people by and large accepted it. And the state bureaucracy, to the extent that one existed back then, and there was one that existed back then, simply began to serve him instead of its old masters. And of course they raised the taxes and monopolized law. That was a big change. Where no such ideology existed in Wales. And so the Normans, who really, they didn't just conquer England, they conquered all over the place. If you look in the history, they were a very expansionist kind of race, I guess you could say. The conquest of Wales took another 250 years, and even then was undone once or twice after that. It did not follow in quick succession. And the same thing is true with Ireland, which is similarly decentralized without a state. Scotland's a little bit of a different story because there was a proto-state there. And basically the point is that if you have a state, you are susceptible to a political defeat. So if an opposing state wishes to conquer another society that also has a state, all that's necessary is for it to defeat that state's military, and by default it will basically control that society unless that society reverts to non-state solutions, which is something that, say, is happening in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's something that can happen. But there can be political victory. When you don't have a political monopolist, when you don't have a state, then there cannot be a political victory. Now, that doesn't mean conquest is impossible, but it means that it has to be literally, physically enacted everywhere. You can't have a simple toppling of one regime and then inherit all of its lands and possessions. You have to physically go place to place to place. And that's not impossible, but it requires vastly more resources. Vastly more. In the case of Wales, it's a much smaller place than the rest of England. And so eventually it did succumb to the aggression of English monarchs. But it took 250 years after the conquest for that to happen. Never mind the fact that it had never been subdued by the Wessex kings for hundreds and hundreds of years. Because there is no Battle of Hastings to be had. There is, and people posit this, well, what if we had Anarchy? What's going to stop another country from attacking? Right now, if another country wanted to attack us, I'm not saying it would be easy, but they would be able to come up with a plan and say, okay, if we can neutralize Washington, if we can neutralize the Pentagon and the U.S. military, then all the money that we have paid for a state would have been basically wasted. In fact, it would have made us less able to defend ourselves because the resources would have been diverted from our are used to that of a state that apparently was unable to use them effectively. In the case of the United States, it is so large and populated that even absent a state, it would be a formidable thing to occupy. In fact, I think literally impossible, at least in today's world. And so, if you have state versus state, it's possible for actually a much smaller country to conquer a bigger one. So you have people like Alexander the Great, who are just tiny little Macedonia, with the Aetolian states being able to overthrow, say, the Persian Empire, something that's many orders of magnitude in size. Or the Romans routinely fought enemies that had larger armies, more populous societies, especially early on, and were able to win. And this is something that is pretty routine when states fight each other. Smaller states can beat bigger states and take over their territory. However, non-state areas have to be invested physically everywhere. You can't just replace the state that's already there, and so it takes much more resources. So, like-sized societies, if you have state society A and stateless society B, and they are similar in their resources, in their populations and their size, society A is very unlikely to be able to overcome society B. Now, if society A has a state and it's also 100 times the size, well, I guess it's possible. So Russia with a state could very likely take over an anarcho-capitalist Estonia or Latvia, although it had a pretty hard time trying to take over a state Finland. But and there are other factors, of course, that determine how effective a defenses, how defensible societies are against aggression that have nothing to do with their political structure. Geography figures pretty highly here. I mean, if you live in an area that's very mountainous and very remote and very difficult to have access to, then that's easier to defend than if you live on the plains. So Afghanistan, is more defensible than, I don't know, the Netherlands. Although the Netherlands initially was actually fairly defensible because it was transacted by many, many rivers that were not very fordable most of the time. So that's one thing. And if we want to draw a contemporary, look at the United States as a potential ANCAP society, the United States is enormously mountainous in most of it. Most of the western third of the country is mountainous/desert. And you have the Great Plains, and then you have lots of rivers, lots of not very fordable rivers like the Mississippi and the Ohio. Even Appalachia is pretty mountainous and pretty well forested. So and even down south, there's lots of swampland, and in the north. The United States is not actually like this really plump apple just waiting to be taken. And that brings me to the other really good example here besides the Welsh. There's lots of examples like this, really, but if we look at the conquest of North America, if we look at pre-Columbian North America, we actually have quite a number of different societies that we can look at. We have obviously and explicitly stateless societies in what is today the United States, at least mostly. There can be some debate. Sometimes some of the places in the southern United States, or maybe up the Mississippi Delta, or up the Mississippi Basin, some people might argue we're a little bit more statey. Some people might say that the Powhatan and the Chesapeake were kind of had proto-states, but mostly that's just adopting our political nomenclature and grafting it onto societies that are basically alien to it. So when people talk about chiefs and tribes, they tend to think of presidents or kings and states, when that's pretty crude and not accurate. Usually chiefs did not have legislative or executive power. They were leaders in the sense that people would listen to them and come to them for advice. In a lot of ways, they were just arbiters. So if there was a dispute, people would come to them and say, hey, resolve this dispute. But they had no inherent authority to be that way. They couldn't command people to, say, join the army. They couldn't say, okay, we're attacking this other village, you all have to go. It was, okay, well, he wants to attack this village, and maybe I'll listen to him, sort of thing. By and large, we should take it on a case-by-case basis, but by and large. If we look in Mesoamerica, we do have states, explicit, large, well-organized, well-funded, long-established states. The most impressive probably would be the Aztec, or the Mexican. It's actually called the Mexica, based at their capital at Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City. I mean, there you're talking about an empire, really, based on a huge city-state. It was probably as big as the biggest cities in Europe. Naples and Constantinople were probably bigger, or about comparable in size. And you have an explicit military culture. You know, they have institutionalized military formations. I've heard estimates that their total mobilization was somewhere in the 500,000 range, which is gigantic. There's nothing in nobody in contemporary Europe was ever mobilizing 500,000 soldiers ever. The Romans never even did it, even at their maximum. And whether the Persians did or not is a different story. It's not until Louis the XIV that we start to see armies that big in Europe. But you know, an aggressive, a state that's used these armies in warfare. They have a home team advantage. They have a city that's pretty defensible. It's on an island, you know, connected by causeways, and you juxtapose, you got that society, and then you go into South America, you have a similar militaristic state in the Inca Empire, and you look at North America, and you have much less developed, much lower population. They're all Stone Age, because they weren't using metal in the way that we like. I mean, they did use metal. They had gold and silver, and some Mesoamericans were using copper, but they are really essentially Stone Age. But the ones in North America are much more primitive. And so just hypothetically, if you ask a political scientist, well, who's going to do better resisting an aggression? If you believe in the state, then you would say definitely the Aztec, definitely the Mesoamerican states. They have powerful states. They have taxation. They have institutionalized militaries. They have central leadership. They have generals. They have all that stuff. And they have bigger populations, and they should be able to resist the onslaught of foreigners to a far greater degree than stateless tribes people in North America. And add to this the fact that by the time Europeans really started to settle North America at the beginning of the 17th century, that society had already been ruined by disease. Europeans were stopping off regularly in North America starting in the early 1500s, although they weren't settling until much later. And the evidence is there was a wave of just devastating plagues that might have killed 90% of the population on the east coast of the United States before Jamestown was ever even settled. We'll never know for sure, but there's evidence to that effect. And for instance, I think it was Henry Cabot, when he sailed up the St. Lawrence River in the it might have been the 1497, or I think though it was in the early 16th century. He said that they thought that there were about 75,000 Indians, what we would call Indians, living in the St. Lawrence River Valley. Now, when Champlain came there 100 years later, there were not 75,000 Indians. There were, in fact, they talked about it being empty. Now, when Cortez landed in Mexico, that had not happened yet. You had not had mass extinction, basically, from disease. You had a fully functional state. Now, at some point during the conquest of Mexico, there was pestilence that visited the Aztec. But even with that, they still were not as disrupted as the northern society. The other thing is, when the Spanish invaded Latin America, it was, I think Cortez landed in 1519, I want to say. It's around 1520. And, the English didn't start settling North America until 1607. So they're 100 years more advanced against a less advanced adversary. So in terms of political ideology, this is no contest. Obviously, the people of Mesoamerica will be protected by their states that will easily wipe away these tiny, like, I mean, the Spanish were invading, what, 400 or 500 guys who weren't even, this is also interesting, were not really members of the state. They were mercenaries. They were there for profit. People had contracts with Cortez saying how much money they'd get paid, blah, 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 how their terms of service. They were not sanctioned by the crown, and they weren't subsidized with taxes, at least not directly. Cortez was not in any kind of political position, really. He wasn't the governor of Cuba. He lived in Cuba. Later, the guy who was the governor of Cuba sued him, basically, for most of his money. And so what happens? Well, Cortez takes over Mexico in 18 months about. He kills Montezuma, or Montezuma's killed by his own people, probably. But anyway, kills the head of the state, and he becomes the new state. I mean, the Spanish go, and they literally build a cathedral on top of the pyramid for sacrificing people. And all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands, or actually millions of subjects of the Aztec Empire become subjects of the Spanish Empire. And Mexico is conquered that quick. Now, actually, a year or two later, Cortez invaded Guatemala, which had stateless societies in it. We didn't have city-states and governments and all that. And he invaded with a far larger force, far more Spanish, far more auxiliary supported by his new Mesoamerican subjects. And he basically crawled back, lucky to have his life. Because you can't just capture one chief and then become the overlord of an entire empire, as was the case with the Aztec. And later, with Pizarro, this is what happened with the Inca. Whereas you juxtapose that with what happened in North America, it took hundreds of years to get that far. And the North American Indians, despite their lack of a state, despite their lack of centralized political control, were able to launch devastating, almost successful military campaigns against their English rivals. In Virginia, there were numerous wars almost every year, several of which almost annihilated the entire colony. In New England, there was peace for the first about 50 years until King Philip's War in 1676. Now, King Philip, people say King Philip, that's just his name. He was not the king in the sense that he had executive or legislative power over the Indians there. And they annihilated like a third of the settlers in New England. I mean, people estimate that they put back settlement 30 years. The entire towns were destroyed. And really, the militias and stuff in Massachusetts were unable to stop him. Eventually, what did stop him is the Iroquois, especially the Mohawk, were induced to attack by the governor of New York, who was an agent of the English crown. He basically went to them and said, "You don't like those Indians, we don't like those Indians, do us a favor, get rid of them," and they did. And that's also interesting because in King Philip's War, like the Indians, in a lot of ways, used much more advanced tactics and military techniques. At the time, you know, when settlers first arrived, the most common type of firearm was a matchlock, the kind that's got actually a burning wick on it. And flintlocks were just getting developed, and the settlers, just because they were kind of ingrained in an organization and an institution that's resistant to change, were still primarily using flintlocks, and the Indians had switched to flintlocks because they're better. I mean, it's one of those things where if you just look at their stats, it's kind of hard to tell, but in effect, when in use, flintlocks are superior, and the Indians had learned this through use before the war and switched to flintlocks. And this is ignoring the whole that they had hit and run tactics, and they were, you know, like, and you have Native American stateless uprisings basically annihilating European-style armies in the 17th century, in the 18th century, even into the 19th century, even late into the 19th century, to the point where, and this is what originally got me thinking about this. A couple years ago, I read a book called The First Armies, and it wasn't about this period at all, but it actually started, its first page, there was a picture of these Apache living in the 1880s in Arizona or someplace, and we have this picture, and it's like the Apache are, you're talking about a couple of hundred warriors tops. I mean, the whole population was a few thousand, but at any given time, only a minority of them were ever fighting. Only a minority of that were ever like braves, and they're totally impoverished. And yet, in the 1880s, they're able to wage an effective resistance against the U.S. military. By the 1870s, the United States had become the greatest industrial power that had ever existed in history. And yet, just inconsequential band of like just such a tiny bit of population are able to effectively resist. And eventually, Geronimo just gave up. He got tired of doing it. He wasn't actually physically defeated, which isn't to say he never would have been. It's just the lack of central control does not make you helpless. I mean, that's kind of the insinuation that I'll get in the comments, like, what are you going to do if China attacks you? Well, stateless societies have the ability, if they want, to resist, and they can do so in a very effective way. And, I mean, I didn't even outline all the times that British or American armies were essentially annihilated by more or less spontaneous defensive action on the part of Native Americans. Well after the states of Mesoamerica had just been totally subjugated to the Spanish. I mean, 100%. So to me, that's actually one of the best case studies, because we really can. It's not perfect because it's human affairs, so you can't have all your control variables, but clearly, like, having the state didn't do the Aztec any good, and if we look again, contemporizing this to the United States. Like I said, there are other variables besides the political structure, and of course geography is important. And geography, in terms of defense, is very favorable to the United States, also because of the oceans. Those are still barriers. They're becoming less and less so, but they still are. But the other thing is, just what is the martial culture of the populace? So you can have two stateless societies, and if one of them people are agrarian farmers and they're not into weaponry and they're not into combat, you have another one that is, well, that latter one likely is going to be better able to defend itself, all things being equal. And again, this is something that you see. Cultures that are more militaristic in their society, which does not necessarily mean militaristic in terms of their state, because there's a lot of stateless societies that are like this, they are much better able to resist than others. And the thing about that is that that type of culture is possible, and the United States is already like halfway there, because we already have a gun culture. I think we should have more of a gun culture, and I think that gun culture should be more integrated into, more focused towards using that for libertarian ends. But we already have that. We're already halfway there. This is why people who PP the United States as a libertarian solution, I don't understand them, because if you go to any place else, that element is gone. I mean, anywhere remotely big. I mean, maybe Kyrgyzstan or Switzerland, but like Latin America, they don't have that, except for maybe like in the FARC guerrilla areas of Panama or Colombia, or Afghanistan. But so. If that was to become, and that you don't need a state to foster that. It doesn't require a state to foster that. Typically, what's fostered that in history is some kind of need for that to exist. So if you were stateless, but you lived in an area where there was a lot of violence, then it made sense to be good at it. And this is kind of true with like a lot of the Native Americans, is because there was warfare between them. And so your average Indian person, Indian guy, would have been exposed to war in a more routine way than his European counterpart. And even the society kind of develops ways to train to that end. So your games, what you do as a kid, your rites of passage are all geared towards becoming basically a warrior. And that means that pound for pound, you're way overmatched against your civilized state counterparts. assuming they don't also have a martial culture, which sometimes they do. And this going back to England and Wales, this kind of interesting tie-in of the two is one interesting thing about England, even after the conquest, is that the state did foster a martial spirit. In fact, they required people to train with arms, originally with bows and arrows. That's the famous English longbow is a result of that. And that is actually the genesis of what would later become the Second Amendment and the idea of bearing arms in the United States. I mean, it literally comes from that. And, I mean, you could probably even trace its roots farther back, but I think that would be a little bit too speculative. So, we're already like halfway there in a lot of ways. Even now, granted, most of the people who are part of the gun culture in the United States are not explicitly libertarians, although they probably agree with the libertarians on quite a bit. They're mostly conservative, you know, and that does usually include a lot of shitty baggage, but that's something we can work with. And obviously, you know, people say with modern technology, firearms are not enough. I totally agree, which is why I'm against like restrictions on all types of weaponry, and I think that people should be able to own anything. Really, I mean, I've even made a video that nukes should be legal. I mean, it definitely doesn't make sense to have one institution have a monopoly on nukes. That's just asking for trouble. And theoretically, whatever we want to argue, it's kind of moot point because that genie's out of the bottle and they don't go back. So there's that, and of course, there are other things that in today's society, resistance against an enemy or whatever, or tyranny, is going to involve a lot of technical expertise when it comes to computers, which is reassuring because a disproportionate number of people who are like that, who are computer nerds, are libertarians. And I remember when I was at PorkFest, this kind of surreal realization, sitting there listening to the very sexy Bitcoin nerds who are all computer programmers and whatever, you know, and they're wearing their trendy pink shirts and sitting up there, and I'm just thinking, those guys are dangerous. They are dangerous. They are more dangerous than the Boston Tea Party, who is a badass and who wants people to become badasses. And if we were a wealthy anarcho-capitalist society, we would be filled with computer programmers and all kinds of stuff. And instead of the really cheap, primitive resistance methods that we see used, they're primitive but effective, that we see used, say, in Afghanistan, would be multiplied in sophistication and effectiveness 1,000-fold, 1,000,000-fold. I mean, some different order of magnitude. And so I just don't see it as that unreasonable, you know. And this is ignoring for now the fact that the state isn't actually defending us; it's defending itself with our money. I thought this was going to be a short video. It's going to be half an hour long, but yeah, definitely. And like I said, you know, most stuff I learned about Mexico and all that, I didn't learn that because I read a Rothbard book about it. I just read regular history books about this stuff. And it's kind of an interesting disconnect because these historians, like this guy, he's lauding the English state. Laud, laud, laud. It's great, it's great. This is why it's so sophisticated, and Wales is backwards for not having it. And yet then admitting that the lack of the state actually makes it more secure from aggression. You know, but it's not meant to be a political science, tome. So I guess you can be forgiven for that oversight. But all right, that's it.